Hey Justin,
Hey, how's it going, man?
good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Awesome, awesome. Um, all right, so welcome everybody to our live stream. Um, Today we're interviewing Justin. I don't know much about you, so I'm looking forward to getting to know you and your journey into the sport, and maybe we can learn a few things from you.
Yeah, of course. So ask away.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so let's bring it back to the origin of you getting into bodybuilding. What initially sparked your interest? What got you into bodybuilding in the first place?
Yeah, so I started competing in 2011. Um, Honestly, I had always trained, really hard since I was 16. I love the idea of, putting on muscle, getting bigger. I played basketball up until my junior year, and I quit, high school basketball because I loved training so much and it would take away from my time training. And it was when I was 19, one of my friends at the time, his cousin was a competitor, and she came up to me one day and she's like, "You should think about a bodybuilding show." And I didn't know what that was. I thought it was like powerlifting, so I did some research. And at first I thought it was a little strange, but then as I, looked into it a little bit more, the idea of it sounded really cool. So then I did my first show ever. It was the OCB Cape Cod Natural in 2011. And then I was hooked ever since, 24 shows later, over the next, I'd say 10 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yep.
So you were training already in the first place. It was just for sport,
Mhm.
really?
Yes. Yep. It was just, it was just really just because I've always been a shorter guy, I'm 5'2". So the idea of putting on a lot of muscle, would help with the self-esteem a little bit,
Okay.
so I love that idea. And then, when bodybuilding came around, actually competing, that's when it took a different course other than just being in the gym to just build muscles, build as much muscle as I can.
Right, right. So the time between you kind of just training for sport to actually stepping on stage, like how much progress in your physique had you made so far? Like where about were you in comparison to where you are today, maybe?
Well, a lot. When I did my first show, I was, I believe, 128 pounds on stage up until my last IFBB show, which was the New York Pro, 2021, where I was 185 pounds on stage.
Big
So
difference.
over that 10 years, yeah, it was a long journey. A lot of progress was made, which I was very, very happy about. It took time, of course, took a lot of patience, but it was definitely a big jump, over the 10 years.
Okay. And then that first show, after having done the first show, were you kind of just like automatically hooked or were you still skeptical? Like, was it, I know it's kind of strange to all of us getting into it, but then we get the bug.
Oh,
Like, what was that like for you?
it was funny. Getting ready the first week before my first show, I was walking around college campus. I was exhausted. My trainer had me eating like 6 pieces of boiled chicken daily, and that's it. No veggies, no salt, no nothing. And I'm like, I don't know if this is for me,
Yeah.
And of course, that those are a lot of old school practices and stuff that we don't really do these days.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm grateful for it. But after my first show, I was hooked. I literally lived on college, on campus in an apartment with, a bunch of other kids, and I moved back home, after my first show because I'm like, oh, I want to focus on
Oh,
bodybuilding,
wow.
and the college environment really wasn't for that, so I moved back home for a while, and then just so I could focus on competing. Obviously, I was still commuting to school and everything. I wanted to get my degree and all that, but it just so I could really focus on training. I had a good group of guys that I trained with back home, and kind of just took off from there.
Okay. Wow. So it was pretty serious right off the bat. You compete, and then it was like, this is my thing. I'm going to do this.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved it. I was hooked. I went from the week before the show thinking I wasn't going to do it again to, you know, taking off the next 10 years.
Wow. What did you end up placing that first show?
Oh, um, so I placed second in the junior division, which was 23 and under. I placed, I think, third in my novice division, but then a month later, I did another show, and I ended up winning the novice overall, and I placed pretty well in the open too. That's when I was like really, really hooked. They gave me a trophy, which was the size of me, and I loved it.
Okay. Awesome. Wow. So guide me through kind of what it looked like. Obviously, that's, your first amateur competition. You became a pro. What was it like in that gap there from first amateur show to pro?
So in 2014, that's when I did my first NPC show. That was the 2014 NPC Powerhouse Classic, put on by the Montanari Brothers Powerhouse Gym in Connecticut. Then after that, I did the Junior USA. I won my class in the lightweight division, and then the next year I did the 2015 NPC USA's in Vegas. I placed third, which I was a pro qualifier, so that was two placings away from my pro card. I was all fired up. And I was going to do the NPC USA's again the following year, because that's the show that I wanted to turn pro at. My father ended up getting a brain tumor, which he's okay.
Good.
Still living to this day. It was just a tough process at the time. So I ended up doing the 2016 Nationals instead, which I ended up winning the lightweight class, and I turned pro. From there, I won as a lightweight, and I wanted to compete in the 212 division, which is 212 and under in the IFBB. So there was a lot of work ahead. A lot of your guys that turn pro in the lightweight divisions, they end up switching to classic. I really didn't want anything to do with that. Bodybuilding was where my heart was. I don't have a classic physique anyways. And then, I took 2017 off, and then I did my first New York Pro in 2018. And I did very well. There was 27 guys. I ended up placing 11th, and then after that, I did 7 more pro shows from then until 2021.
Okay. Awesome. Was there any like standout challenges or anything like that you dealt with in the amateur leagues and NPC that when you were trying to become pro that were really just kind of like discouraging or anything like that?
In terms of challenges, I love this stuff. Obviously, we can speak of challenges in regards to the nutrition and being depleted and doing a contest prep in general. The amount of cardio, things like that. But those weren't really challenges to me. I kind of embraced it. I loved it all. The hardcore process, it really appealed to me. I love that. I would say more so like balancing, relationships, things like that, friends and, a significant other. Those are some things that I maybe had a hard time with, because of how much that I was pouring into bodybuilding. Everything else kind of took a back seat, which, and I'm a believer, when you do anything to the elite level and to the extreme, those things happen. There can be a way around it, which I was a young guy. I didn't handle things all that well, and my focus was my focus and really nothing else mattered, so there's ways as an athlete that you can work around that. So I would say that would be probably consider my hardships coming up. But in terms of the actual training, I knock on wood, I never had, really any injuries or anything that set me back other than like the little aches and pains here and there. I didn't really have to deal with any hardships in regards to that. It was more just, balancing, life, relationships, things like that with trying to be an elite level competitor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. Looking back now, what could you have changed, or if you would give advice to an amateur now, like, would you say that's kind of the only way to do it to become pro? You really got to block out everything, or were there some things that maybe you could have done to balance those relationships better?
No, I would say that you can definitely maintain your relationships. Absolutely. As I mentioned, I was a younger guy, and I would say maybe immature in regards to that. In regards to, what this requires to become an elite level competitor, it's 24/7, 365. It's one of those things that you need to do this and you need to focus on it. That's, I would say, the biggest mistake that I've seen with competitors over time is a lot of them are kind of half in, half out, and a lot of them don't understand the level of discipline this requires to make it to the elite level. And again, we're speaking in terms of the elite level here, not, just a person that wants to kind of do this for fun, which that's fine too. That's fine too. But to keep progressing into that level, it requires extreme commitment and dedication. I would say commitment is probably the best word. That's the best advice I can give. Like, you have to fully understand what this kind of thing requires before you dive into it. Because I've seen over the years, especially like, when I was coaching a lot, competitors just aren't ready for the level of commitment that this takes when it comes to nutrition, the outside factor other than just the gym, more importantly, the off season. The off season, I would say, is where I see competitors make the biggest mistakes, is because they don't put into their off seasons what they do contest prep. And the off season is where, your physique is built. So that's the best advice that I can give a competitor is, one, understand what level of commitment this requires, the level of commitment it requires to become elite, and take it seriously. Go in all out. But that does not, again, that does not mean that you can't have a relationship, or you have to ditch your friends, your family, things like that. That stuff can be balanced, absolutely. But in terms of
Um,
the focus on the sport, it's got to be that.
yeah, yeah, makes sense. How have, other than the obvious physical changes, how have you changed after having gone through that journey?
Um, I, I've honestly, bodybuilding has really taught me that, I know this sounds cliche and not to sound corny, but you can really do anything. Bodybuilding contest preps, getting through some of those days were the hardest things I've ever done in my life. And it kind of gave me the mentality for, work ethic, which has, transferred into my business, working for the NPC, things like that. It really gives you that, I would say, hardcore mindset that you can do anything if you really put your mind to it, push towards it, and if you work your butt off for it,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say it was literally bodybuilding and a lot of those contest preps that were real hard that really taught me that, because after you get through them, and after, win or lose, you're like, wow, I did that,
Mm-hmm.
and I worked this hard and it got me this result. So you kind of carry that mentality, into more so adulthood.
Yeah.
Now that I'm in my 30s, I have that mindset. I'm like, all right, well, this is what I want. This is what it's going to take. And I would say understanding the commitment of what things take is what bodybuilding has taught me.
Awesome. That's a beautiful thing. Um, Switching gears here. I know you're a nutrition coach, right? Um, as a nutrition coach, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see athletes making when they come to you?
All right, so I worked with a lot of competitors over my time. I don't work with competitors anymore because I did work myself up into the judging ranks, and also promoting shows, things like that. So I don't work with competitors anymore, but I still have my whole business in terms of individuals that want to take their physique to the next level, lifestyle clients, so to say. Um, and I have the majority of my people are just as serious as competitors. So I'll always be a nutrition coach. I love that aspect. A trainer. It's just I'm on a little bit different of a side of things these days because of my role as a judge. But as a someone who works with people nutritionally, whether they're an athlete or not, um, I would say the biggest mistakes that I see made are the lack of consistency. Nutrition is huge. Nutrition is just as important as training. And I would say that that's where I see individuals, regardless of the level that they're, trying to achieve, whether it's, you know, not being able to follow their diet day in and day out, um, falling into cravings, things like that, falling into outside factors that kind of veer them off plan, and also doing things excessively. Now, listen, working with a lot of people nutritionally, the main goal is so they can have a life, balance it, but still take their physique to the next level, and that's okay. You don't have to diet like you're a bodybuilder 1 week out, to maintain a good physique or to have a physique reaching a new level than what you've had. It just comes down to that balance and your effort. But the main thing I see is that, a lot of people do things excessively, whether it's a vacation or whether it's a cheat meal, going overboard and not having that balance can really affect them and their progress and the results. Like one thing that I always say to my nutrition clients that may have a hard time staying on diet, snacking, things like that, is I ask them, like, listen, the next time you want to have a snack, which is normal, we all get hungry, we're all human. I say, ask yourself in that moment if that short-term satisfaction is worth getting in the way of your long-term goal. And then you decide from there.
Mm.
You either eat it or you don't. So it's just having those little simple cues to mentally be able to keep people on track, within reason. I think is one of the biggest things that, one of the most important things of being a nutrition coach.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. Um, so I'm curious, and I don't know if that I mean, it applies to nutrition, but maybe holistically with bodybuilding. Like, do you find that, because I know you have a degree in exercise science, right?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
do you find that your education still holds up today, or have you learned so much anecdotally just from being a competitor, from being a judge, from being a coach, that now it's like completely different and doesn't really apply?
Great question. Um, I'd like to think that it applies a lot, because I spent all that money on my degree. But that's not reality. And listen, my exercise physiology degree has absolutely been useful, especially when it comes to training, writing training programs, things like that, understanding, metabolism. I had nutrition courses as well. So that stuff is very important. Anybody that, wants to get into this, I do encourage, getting a degree.
Hmm.
When I used to prep competitors, slightly different story. That's a lot of application that you're not going to learn in college. You're not going to learn in school because they're not teaching you to prep bodybuilders. So I would say my nutrition practices, I definitely learned more so on my own, along the way, own personal research, working with different bodies, which is carried into me mainly working with people's nutrition today. I mean, of course, I do training programs like with an online client. I do training as well. I don't train people in person just because my schedule doesn't permit. I mean, I hope to get back to that someday because I do love training individuals. But you know, everything that I apply today, it's more so what I learned on my own, working with so many different bodies. And this is the kind of business that I believe application and trial and error and working with so many people over time is the real education.
Hmm.
Not saying that my degree isn't important because it absolutely is, but I would say the real education comes from working with more and more and more physiques over time. I've worked with, I can honestly say, you know, thousands of people in the last, I'd say 12 years, so it's just a lot of trial and error, which I think that's the main thing to becoming, a nutrition coach that can kind of apply things and understand different bodies.
Hmm. That actually leads perfectly into my next question, because, as we know, everybody's different, right? Everybody's got different genetics
Mm-hmm.
and responds differently. So how do you balance kind of like when you take on a new client, how do you balance, okay, I know what works generally, right? And I have
Mm-hmm.
principles that work generally,
Yeah,
but still there is a level of trial and error that you're going to have to go through with that client, right? Because you have to figure them
of
out.
course.
And so like how do you balance that? And maybe if we could try to pin it down, like what specifically are you looking for in that phase? Like what are you testing?
Yep, great question. So when I take on an individual, I have them fill out preliminary info. Okay, that's pretty much everything about them, what they're doing, their nutrition practices right now, exercise program, supplementation that they use, their schedules, what time they wake up, train, go to sleep. That information is crucial to taking someone on. Okay, that's how, you need to know that so you're not just developing a cookie cutter plan. Now, listen, the reality is sometimes I get prelim info from people that I don't diet. I don't do this, nothing. So it's just kind of like a clean slate. So that's where I got to apply a program. And I'm very straightforward with people up front. I say, listen, like you're not paying me for this program right now. You're paying me for along the way because what I may give you may work for a week, may work for 6 weeks, may not work at all. It's just having that preliminary info to analyze. That's what just kind of gives me the basis of how to develop the plan, which I think would best fit for the time being. And then analyzing how their body responds over time, that's really where the coaching is done.
Okay.
And then knowing when to, change the nutrition, maybe change training, change up cardio, but it all stems from that prelim info, so
Hmm.
that's the most important part of coaching. And that's how I apply, different things that I have learned over time, maybe different practices. I may see a different body type and, say, all right, this might work for them, but we got to try it out. Any coach, in my opinion, that says, all right, you pay me and I'm going to give you this plan that's going to work. You know, that's not really the case. That's just more so, a selling point at that point. Everything is a question mark in the beginning, but
Hmm.
learning how to apply different things, learning how to start someone from a basis and then change it as the process goes along to their metabolism, to how they're responding, hormones, things like that. That's where the coaching is done.
Okay. Interesting. Um, Are there any trends that you're seeing right now in either fitness or nutrition online on social media that you think are just like overrated or misunderstood or anything like that? Maybe something people are just talking too much about that doesn't really make a difference.
Um, that's a great question because I've experienced 12 years of trends.
Hmm.
When it comes to maybe different diet types. Obviously there's things like Ozempic, that pop up now. Joe Rogan has a podcast where he talks about different things, and um, then like for example, right now creatine is hot, which creatine's a phenomenal product, and I think everybody should be using it. But there are different trends. I mean, I wouldn't say right now nothing has really jumped out to me. I would say for a while it was, intermittent fasting. People were really hot on that. And although that isn't an approach that I would apply to someone, not saying it doesn't work. It's just for certain goals, I believe in certain things. Someone who's trying to put on a good amount of muscle, maybe that doesn't apply. But I would say, obviously there was, keto trend for a while. That I feel like that's been one that's kind of been back and forth over the years. It gets hot for 6 months, then it disappears. Then it gets hot for 6 months, then it disappears again.
Hmm.
Which not saying that diet or approach doesn't work either. It just has to be done very carefully, very specifically to the right people. So I would say that these trends that come up, a lot of times the people that are falling into them, it's not necessarily the approach for them.
Hmm.
It's just kind of what's hot and what they're reading online right now.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. Um, so talking about supplementation
Mhm.
a little bit, because we just touched on the creatine. If you had to pick a set of supplements that would be your absolute go-tos for the greatest amount of people, right? Like just your general gonna work for almost everybody stack, how would you put that together?
Oof, great question. There's a good amount of products. Now, listen, like the basis of everything is training and nutrition. Okay, that's where we get our results. Supplements are a supplement to nutrition, but they can be very helpful. Like for example, like we just touched upon creatine. Creatine is a phenomenal product. Okay, it's researched, it's increased strength, output, to volumize the muscle cell. I think that's something that everybody can benefit from. Things like glutamine. Glutamine, great for digestion, great for recovery. Um, you, you have whey protein, whey protein isolate. I'm big with putting people on a whey protein isolate. Although a lot of people don't like protein powders, some people it doesn't work for them. They prefer whole food. I think that it's very useful to give you that break from whole food, especially for digestion wise. Like you take a person that's trying to build muscle, trying to build a really good amount of muscle. They have to eat a lot of food. And sometimes doing, 5 or 6 meals a day of just whole food, it's very tough. And sometimes it might not be realistic for their work schedules, things like that. So supplementing with a whey protein or whey protein isolate, it's very beneficial. So I think that could be a staple for someone. Me personally, for someone who's, trying to build muscle, I think intra-workout nutrition is phenomenal. And it was John Meadows who really, stapled that into my mindset. For example, I use the Granite recovery religiously every single training session. It's been that way for 4 years. It's a combination of essential amino acids, cluster dextrin. It has some sensorol in it, which is a form of ashwagandha to lower training stress. Something like that for someone who's trying to build muscle, I think is absolutely an essential. So there are a lot of products we could talk about. Those are just kind of some that come to mind that I think that pretty much everybody could use. Now, listen, if someone's trying to burn some body fat, maybe having a hard time burning body fat, that's where, maybe analyzing intra-workout nutrition may not fit best. It just depends on the actual goal.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I'm curious too. I'm assuming you have coached both natural and performance enhanced athletes, right?
Yes.
Um, is there a difference at all? And if so, what is that difference in your approach to training them? Like, is there anything like, obviously you're making them a training program, you're
Mm-hmm.
making them a nutrition plan. Is it vastly different? Is it the same stuff that works for everybody? It's just at a different rate of speed? Like, what does that
I
look
would
like?
say, I would say that's the main difference, a different rate of speed. Okay. Training wise, no, not natural or enhanced. I'm a believer in heavy weight, you know, proper form builds muscle. Okay, progressive overload, increasing workloads, strength equals density. That's going to be the same regardless if you're natural or if you're not natural. However, obviously just at a different rate. An individual who's enhanced is going to build muscle faster than an individual who's not. That's a given. Nutrition wise, I would say there's a little bit of a difference. For example, maybe something with protein. A lot of guys that are enhanced, maybe I might have them on higher protein intake because they can synthesize more. They can synthesize at more of an efficient rate, so they might be able to handle a little bit more food. But all in all, supplementation that's not natural is icing on the cake. Okay, it's more so our training and nutrition is our blueprint, whether you're natural or you're not natural. I had this conversation 3 different times in my check-ins that I just did this morning. It's one of those things to where you need, when you have an enhanced athlete, they need to be using that as just an enhancement. And like I use the term icing on the cake because everything else still needs to be applied as if you're natural. How hard you train, the way you eat, things like that. It's not like you're going to take those, enhancements and then all of a sudden everything's going to be great. You're going to get your results right then and there. It's not those that yield the results. They can lead you down the path of achieving results faster than a natural athlete, of course, but these key ingredients need to be part of the mix, your training and nutrition, sleep, water intake, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So, because I see comments all the time, right,
Yes,
where people just discredit somebody's progress because they're like, oh, he's on
of
gear,
course.
right? But like, just to dispel that myth right now, it's not like you have a performance enhanced athlete that you're going to say, oh, you really don't have to train super hard here, do 2 sets, right? Like, it's not like that.
Exactly. If anything, more, or you could even make the argument more. Like if I have an enhanced athlete, we're put like in that ability to move more workloads. The strength is increasing, so you need to take advantage of it. If we're using an anabolic, if someone's using anabolic, it's helping us get stronger and stuff, but you're kind of training soft, it's not going to do anything.
Mm.
You still need to utilize that and train really hard. So if anything, it allows you to put in more work, so you need to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
Recovery is one thing. Someone that's on anabolics, they're going to recover at a better rate, a faster rate. So that needs to be taken advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
With nutrition, with the outside variables that we need to live 24/7 outside of the gym.
I like that. Okay, so our current landscape, social media, obviously there's a ton of noise. Okay, you can look and somebody will tell you to do this exercise and you keep scrolling and 3 videos later somebody's telling you that that's the worst exercise ever, right? It's really hard to trust what's working, what's not working, who you should believe. I'm curious to know, in your experience and when you were getting through it and stuff like that, like where were you looking to learn the very best way of going about things? And if you were to pinpoint some resources today to cut through the noise, like where should somebody look to get good, accurate information?
Okay, so I come from a time to where we looked up to Jay Cutler, Jose Raymond, guys that kept things real simple to build muscle. Okay, the one thing that I see online these days is everything's overcomplicated. There's a million different methods. There's a million different things. Like you just said, no matter what you do or say, someone's going to say to do it different. John Meadows. John Meadows was an individual that I looked to where that's how it's done, and that's how I'm going to follow.
Mm-hmm.
That's to build muscle, to achieve those goals. In regards to looking to where, looking for your advice, you have to look at the people that have done it, now listen, I know that there's a science behind all of this stuff. I know that there are individuals that genetically maybe they haven't made as much progress due to their genetics, and they can be very smart individuals. But my advice, especially to younger guys, is you look to those that have done this, have maybe built some strong physiques themselves, or have helped others achieve, good physiques, whether that's a competitor or just in general. You always want to look at the results that that source has produced, not just what they're spewing online.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because anybody can go on Google, look some things up, and start talking about different methods. You have to look at essentially the resume, not only just for themselves, their personal physique, because like I said, you can have an individual who's a genetic freak, and that exists to where, they built a phenomenal physique, but it's been pretty simple and straightforward. And some other people may just need a little bit more different of a route. But you look to the individuals that have guided other people, to good physiques, maybe physiques that you admire, and that's where you look to for your information, because they've done it, they've walked the walk themselves, or they've walked the walk with their clients and individuals that they've helped.
Yeah, makes sense. You knew John personally, right?
Yes, I did. Yes.
I'm curious to know, like, any lessons that you gained from him that stand out, or any good memories that you had with him.
Oh yeah. I'll never forget, he came up to Massachusetts with myself and Andrew Berry. We were doing a seminar at Cape Cod Nutrition, and we trained. We trained back on Friday, then we trained legs the next day. And John was one of my idols, and I wanted to impress him. It was my first time ever training with him, and he had us do cluster sets. Cluster sets, just a quick rundown for anyone who doesn't know. It's you have the same workload for essentially 4 mini sets in one. So for example, we were on the leg press, and we'd pick a workload that we could do for, let's say, 8 reps in a cluster set. You do 4 sets of that 8 reps with maybe 10 to 15 seconds rest in between. So me being a younger guy wanting to impress John, he put on a workload for me, and I'm like, no, I can do more. He's like, are you sure? Like, we're doing the cluster, you're gonna have to repeat this, for 4 sets. And I'm like, I got it, John. And this was leg press. This wasn't squats or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So puts me through the cluster. The 3rd set in, we were doing 4. I turned pale white. I see Andrew smiling in the corner. And then I got through it somehow, just out of straight willpower to not look silly in front of John. And then from the leg press, I ran right to the trash barrel.
Oh yeah.
And I came back, and he was like, I told you. I'm like, yes, you did. And we had a great time. The thing about John is, as well as he was respected and, I would say, use the word, quote, famous in our industry, he was a regular guy. He was a regular guy, and he was so easy to talk. After the seminar, he was going home the next morning, and we had nothing to do. He's like, hey, you want to go see the Joker? The Joker came out at the time. We went to go see the Joker, and we just hung out for the night. It was so cool. He was a regular guy. He just wanted to help people, and he took his passion, for this stuff, for helping people, for training, nutrition, and that's how he made it to where he was. John used to say, like, you lead with passion. The money will come later. And you can kind of tell, like, what coaches, what fitness individuals do this out of passion, not just for the money they can make on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, switching gears a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I love how you kind of turn this passion into a career, right? And
Yes.
in a really unique way. You're a judge now, right?
Yep.
But you were doing coaching, you competed. I think it's really, really difficult relative to, like, another industry,
Mm-hmm.
maybe, right? To actually make a living out of this, because it's so niche, because it is growing, but still relatively small to other industries, right?
Yes.
And there's not maybe too many options for what role you could take in the space.
Yep.
How do you see it? Like, if an amateur is coming to you and they're like, I love this. It's the only thing I think about. I live and breathe bodybuilding. Obviously, I love to train and I'm competing, but, like, I want to make a career out of this. And, like, what advice would you have for them?
So first of all, I would say a career wouldn't necessarily be through competing. Okay. Your top Olympians, they make great money. They make a living for that time period that they are competing, through actually competing, sponsors, things like that. But, things are a lot different these days. I would say you make a career through building a training business. whether it's an online training business, in person, nutrition, that's where my advice would be, to, get your education, of course. That's what leads someone to build a career in this business. Competing helps. It's funny because I used to think that, when I got my IFBB pro card, nothing would change. It's a pro card that's a great accomplishment, but, it did kind of change things a little bit for me, because, for some reason, people see that almost as like a form of education, even though it's not, and people want to train under or listen to, maybe someone that they necessarily look up to. Mm-hmm. So if someone is competing, I would give them the advice like, yeah, you take it to the fullest. You know what I mean? Because if you get your education and if you can work and if you're good working with people, you competing is going to be a great example. You're going to be that person walking the walk for the individuals that, your clients, the people that you're coaching. So although I could say like, competing doesn't do anything. No, it does. It allows you to be on a platform to be a great example for individuals that you're trying to help, and the individuals you're trying to help are what builds your business and what builds your career. So I know you don't need to compete forever, but it's one of those things that it does help. And, I guess I would say, again, what John used to say, you lead with passion. I know it's not easy to, just randomly start getting clients and everything. You're going to have to put in some work, and you can't expect to get paid right away. That's the biggest thing that I see these days, mistakes. Everyone starts becoming a coach and they want to charge all this money when, they really haven't kind of been there and done that, and that might work for a few people, but that's not how you're going to build a career. You're going to build a career from the results that you're able to produce, and that's going to come from your passion when it comes to this stuff. The more you want to learn, the more you want to apply, that's going to yield the results. The results are going to yield the career.
Mm-hmm. So do you think getting your pro card, like if everything had remained the same, right, but you just never competed, but let's say you got just as big and, you went in the coaching route and you had clients, whatever, like, did it make a meaningful difference to get that pro card? Would it have been different had you not gotten that pro card?
Good question. I do think maybe getting my pro card made a difference for me in that time period, because like I said, people, although this isn't the right mindset, people, saw that pro status as, okay, he's a pro in general with nutrition and training, even though, like I said, that's not the case. I got my pro card because, I was a good competitor. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I could have been a dummy when it came to nutrition or training, you know what I mean? But, so I would say, yes, it was impactful. I would say these days, there's a lot of pros, there's a lot of coaches. So just having your pro card isn't what's going to yield your career and get people to trust you. Mm-hmm. Again, it's going to come down to the results you produce for others, but you produce those results with passion and not expecting, these big paychecks right away. Mm-hmm. The money will come later based on what you're able to produce.
Mm. Yeah, it makes sense. You've been in it for a while now. We're talking decades. Mm-hmm. What keeps you motivated still to this day? You're super involved. I would argue you're as involved as you could be as a judge, right?
Yeah.
So, what keeps you motivated?
It's my life. I'm on the road every weekend for shows, and I can't say that it ever gets old. I love bodybuilding. I love fitness. I guess that's the answer to me staying motivated is the answer of I don't need the motivation. I know it's kind of a twist, but I just love this stuff that much. What it's done for me, my career. But the judging thing, I'm very passionate about. It was a big transition from me, coaching a lot of competitors to now just really judging and not working with competitors on that. And I feel as though I can have a stronger impact on them. That's the one thing that I always wanted since I was younger is I said to myself, I want to get to a point one day to where I have a lot of impact on others with my love for this stuff, and of course I did, coaching. I still have an impact on individuals that I coach outside of competing, which is my whole business. But especially judging, I'm in front of hundreds and hundreds of competitors that are looking for direction. And I you get to be one of those individuals that guides them, and that's, I'm never going to take that for granted. I'm never going to give a competitor the cold shoulder because I was them. I was them. I was a coach, so I had competitors, so I like, there's really nothing that keeps me motivated. My motivation is just that I love it, and it just never, ever gets old. I judged maybe 25 shows last year on the road every weekend.
Wow.
And it doesn't faze me. I'm grateful for the opportunities. I'm grateful that I've been in that position to, score shows, to help determine results. I take that position very seriously, because you dictate the show. And then, like I said, more importantly, with feedback wise, things like that, you dictate the direction of competitors and their coaches and what they're going to improve on to continue their career. So I guess that's a tough question to answer. There's nothing that really keeps me motivated. It's just I love this stuff, and I don't necessarily need the motivation.
No, I think that hits perfectly though on really the general mindset behind the community. I've yet to run across somebody that has a career in bodybuilding that you see them at a show and they've got the same attitude as somebody with a dead end 9 to 5 job and they're like, oh, here I go again, still doing this. Like, you don't really run across that. Um, okay, so I guess final words, kind of like, what, if anything, wisdom or tips or anything like that for aspiring competitors that are looking to you specifically? They like the way that you did your, journey, your career, where you are now. They want to be in your shoes. What would you tell them? And second part to the question is kind of like, we touched on it a little bit, but like, if you could define what legacy or impact you would like to have on the sport, what would that be?
Okay, so first part of the question, my advice would be, you take advantage of every day, whether that's training, nutrition, whether that's with your clients, whether that's any role you have when it comes to stuff, you take advantage of every day. It's one of those things where you need to have patience as well. Not everything's going to come so fast. My biggest piece of advice would be having patience, understanding that, winning shows isn't going to come right away. Understanding that having 100 clients isn't going to come right away. But that's okay. You keep plugging and you do it because you love it. Okay. Because if you keep that road of passion, all that's going to come later. You just have to keep executing every day and, taking advantage of every single aspect that you can. I know sometimes we're tired. I know sometimes we don't feel like working, but if you love this stuff and if you really want to make a career, it's a hard career. It really is, because it's very competitive, but at the end of the day, the people that do this because they love it, that's always going to stand out, and there's always going to be room for those people. Second part of the question, my legacy that I want to leave on, I guess I just want to be someone that, people look back on and, like, he did this right. He was someone that always, steered a competitor or a client or anybody, the right way. I guess I want people to be able to tell, like, that I really did love this stuff. Like, oh, okay, like Justin Randall, like, he was the guy because you wanted to go to him, for advice because he really wanted to help, and he really wanted to see you do your best at anything, whether that's, like I said, competing, just taking your physique to the next level, whether it's, pursuing your degree, pursuing being a coach or whatever. I want people to look back on me and, consider me like I was the person to go to for advice.
Awesome. Okay, I said final question, but final question. Just generally the sport, kind of like, where do you see it going? Do you think it could be as big as one of the major league sports one
Yeah.
day, like an NFL, NBA, and what
Um,
is?
that level will be tough, but it's only getting bigger and bigger. More mainstream, which is a great thing. You know, I think that the people that are involved with this sport and fitness nowadays, it just blows away the amount. Like, for example, like when you walk into a gym these days, let's say any commercial gym, there's probably maybe 20, 30 competitors. Whereas, back then it was, if you competed, you were a freak. Like, oh my God, that person does bodybuilding
Mm.
shows. It's that could be good and bad, but I think it's mainly good for getting people into fitness, getting people into health, getting people moving, and having this stuff so mainstream to where, the people that lead the sport, those are idols that motivate others. And it can really lead people to, a better lifestyle.
Mhm. Awesome. Um, well, I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Appreciate you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can follow this up in the future. I am curious to know more about kind of like the judging aspect of
Hmm.
things, but maybe we can explore that in the future. And
Yeah, absolutely.
just for anybody that might be watching this when we put it on YouTube or somewhere else, like if they wanted to get in touch with you for coaching or advice or anything like that, like how can they go about doing that?
So I'm pretty active on my Instagram. I have, my Instagram. I have the NPC Rhode Island's page. That's not really for my business. I promote a show in Rhode Island, which is coming up in 6 weeks. My email is on my personal page. But I'm pretty available to those, especially via Instagram.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
All right. Thank
Awesome.
you. Bye.
Bye.